Hello and welcome back to A People's Historian. My name's Jason Kishinev. Each episode we'll read about 30 minutes or so of a real history, the kind of history that tells you the truth. We're in chapter 18 of A People's History of the United States by Howard Zinn, and reading about the Vietnam War. So let's dig in, shall we? I think I'm rereading this paragraph. I think that I read this paragraph at the end of the last episode, but we'll read it again just to be on the safe side. The CIA in Vietnam, in a program called Operation Phoenix, secretly, without trial, executed at least 20,000 civilians in South Vietnam who were suspected of being members of the Communist Underground. A pro-administration analyst wrote in the journal Foreign Affairs in January 1975, although the Phoenix program did undoubtedly kill or incarcerate many innocent civilians, it did also eliminate many members of the communist infrastructure. After the war, the release of records of the International Red Cross showed that in South Vietnamese prison camps, where at the height of the war 65,000 to 70,000 people were held and often beaten and tortured, American advisors observed and sometimes participated. Let's read that again. American advisors observed and sometimes participated in the beating or torturing of POWs. Okay. The Red Cross observers found continuing systematic brutality at the two principal Vietnamese POW camps at Phu Quoc and Quy Nhon, where American advisors were stationed. By the end of the Vietnam War, 7 million tons of bombs had been dropped on Vietnam, more than twice the total bombs dropped on Europe and Asia in World War II. Almost one 500-pound bomb for every human being in Vietnam. It was estimated that there were 20 million bomb craters in the country. In addition, poisonous sprays were dropped by planes to destroy trees and any kind of growth. An area the size of the state of Massachusetts was covered with such poison. Vietnamese mothers reported birth defects in their children. Yale biologists, using the same poison on mice, reported defective mice born and said they had no reason to believe the effect on humans was any different. On March 16, 1968, a company of American soldiers went into the hamlet of My Lai 4 in Quang Ngai province. They rounded up the inhabitants, including old people and women with infants in their arms. These people were ordered into a ditch where they were methodically shot to death by American soldiers. The testimony of James Dursey, a rifleman at the later trial of Lieutenant William Calley, was reported in the New York Times. Lieutenant Calley and a weeping rifleman named Paul D. Medlow, the same soldier who had fed candy to the children before shooting them, pushed the prisoners into the ditch. There was an order to shoot by Lieutenant Calley. I can't remember the exact words. It was something like, "Start firing." Medlow turned to me and said, "Shoot! Why don't you shoot?" He was crying. I said, "I can't. I won't." Then Lieutenant Calley and Medlow pointed their rifles into the ditch and fired. People were diving on top of each other. Mothers were trying to protect their children. Journalist Seymour Hersh, in his book My Lai 4, writes, when Army investigators reached the barren area in November 1969, in connection with the My Lai probe in the United States, they found mass graves at 3 sites, as well as a ditch full of bodies. It was estimated that between 450 and 500 people, most of them women, children, and old men, had been slain and buried there. I saw a really great documentary on the My Lai massacre. I recommend it, except I can't tell you the name. The Army tried to cover up what happened. It might be just called My Lai, actually. The Army tried to cover up what happened, but a letter began circulating from a GI named Ron Riddenhauer, who had heard about the massacre. There were photos taken of the killing by an Army photographer, Ronald Haberle. Seymour Hersh, then working for an anti-war news agency in Southeast Asia called Dispatch News Service, wrote about it. Period. The story of the massacre had appeared in May 1968 in two French publications, one called Sud Vietnam en Lutte, and another published by the North Vietnamese delegation to the peace talks in Paris. But the American press did not pay any attention. Several of the officers in the My Lai massacre were put on trial, but only Lieutenant William Calley was found guilty. He was sentenced to life imprisonment, but his sentence was reduced twice. He served 3 years. Nixon ordered that he be under house arrest rather than a regular prison, and then was paroled. Wow. Thousands of Americans came to his defense. Part of it was in patriotic justification of his action as necessary against the communists. Part of it seems to have been a feeling that he was unjustly singled out in a war with many similar atrocities. Colonel Orrin Henderson, who had been charged with covering up the My Lai killings, told reporters in early 1971, every unit of brigade size has its My Lai hidden someplace. Indeed, My Lai was unique only in its details. Hersh reported a letter sent by a GI to his family and published in a local newspaper. Dear Mom and Dad, today we went on a mission and I'm not very proud of myself, my friends, or my country. We burned every hut in sight. It was a small rural network of villages and the people were incredibly poor. My unit burned and plundered their meager possessions. Let me try to explain the situation to you. The huts here are thatched palm leaves. Each one has a dried mud bunker inside. These bunkers are to protect the families, kind of like air raid shelters. My unit commanders, however, chose to think that these bunkers are offensive. So every hut we find that has a bunker we are ordered to burn to the ground. When the 10 helicopters landed this morning in the midst of these huts, and 6 men jumped out of each chopper, we were firing the moment we hit the ground. We fired into all the huts we could. It is then that we burn these huts. Everyone is crying, begging and praying that we don't separate them and take their husbands and fathers, sons and grandfathers. The women wail and moan. Then they watch in terror as we burn their homes, personal possessions, and food. Yes, we burn all rice and shoot all livestock. The more unpopular became the Saigon government, the more desperate the military effort became to make up for this. A secret congressional report of late 1967 said the Viet Cong were distributing about 5 times more land to the peasants than the South Vietnamese government, whose land distribution program had come to a virtual standstill. The report said, the Viet Cong have eliminated landlord domination and reallocated lands owned by absentee landlords and the GVN, Government of Vietnam, to the landless and others who cooperate with Viet Cong authorities. The unpopularity of the Saigon government explains the success of the National Liberation Front in infiltrating Saigon and other government-held towns in early 1968 without the people there warning the government. The NLF thus launched a surprise offensive. It was the time of Tet, their New Year holiday, that carried them into the heart of Saigon, immobilized Ton San Nut airfield, even occupied the American embassy briefly. The offensive was beaten back, but it demonstrated that all the enormous firepower delivered on Vietnam by the United States had not destroyed the NLF, its morale, its popular support, its will to fight. It caused a reassessment in the American government, more doubts among the American people. The massacre at My Lai by a company of ordinary soldiers was a small event compared with the plans of high-level military and civilian leaders to visit massive destruction on the civilian population of Vietnam. Assistant Secretary of Defense John McNaughton in early 1966, seeing that large-scale bombing of North Vietnam villages was not producing the desired result, suggested a different strategy. The airstrikes on villages, he said, the airstrikes on villages, he said, would create a counterproductive wave of revulsion abroad and at home. He suggested instead destruction of locks and dams, however, if handled right, might offer promise. It should be studied. Such destruction doesn't kill or drown people. By shallow flooding the rice, it leads after a time to widespread starvation, more than 1 million, unless food is provided, which we could offer to do at the conference table. The heavy bombings were intended to destroy the will of ordinary Vietnamese to resist, as in the bombings of German and Japanese population centers in World War II. Despite Johnson's public insistence that only military targets were being bombed, the government was using language like "one more turn of the screw" to describe bombing. The CIA at one point in 1966 recommended a bombing program of greater intensity, according to the Pentagon Papers, directed against, in the CIA's words, the will of the regime as a target system. Meanwhile, just across the border of Vietnam, in a neighboring country, Laos, where a right-wing government installed by the CIA faced a rebellion, one of the most beautiful areas in the world, the Plain of Jars, was being destroyed by bombing. This was not reported by the government or the press, but an American who lived in Laos, Fred Bramfman, told the story in his book, Voices from the Plain of Jars. Over 25,000 attack sorties were flown against the Plain of Jars from May 1964 through September 1969. Over 75,000 tons of bombs were dropped on it. On the ground, thousands were killed and wounded, tens of thousands driven underground, and the entire above-ground society leveled. Bramfman, who spoke the Laotian language and lived in a village with a Laotian family, interviewed hundreds of refugees from the bombings who poured into the capital city of Vientiane. He recorded their statements and preserved their drawings. A 26-year-old nurse from Shangquang told of her life in her village. "I was at one with the earth, the air, the upland fields, the paddy, and the seed beds of my village. Each day and night in the light of the moon, I and my friends from the village would wander, calling out and singing through forest and field amid the cries of the birds. During the harvesting and planting season, we would sweat and labor together under the sun and the rain, contending with poverty and miserable conditions, continuing the farmer's life which has been the profession of our ancestors. But in 1964 and 1965, I could feel the trembling of the earth and the shock from the sounds of arms exploding around my village. I began to hear the noise of airplanes circling about in the heavens. One of them would stick its head down and, plunging earthward, loose a loud roar, shocking the heart as light and smoke covered everything so that one could not see anything at all. Each day we would exchange news with the neighboring villagers of the bombings that had occurred, the damaged houses, the injured, and the dead. The holes. During that time we needed holes to save our lives. We who were young took our sweat and our strength, which should have been spent raising food in the rice fields and forests to sustain our lives, and squandered it digging holes to protect ourselves. One young woman explained why the revolutionary movement in Laos the Neo-Lao attracted her and so many of her friends. Neo-Lao, I've not heard that term. Or I have because I've read this book twice, but I don't remember it. As a young girl, I had found that the past had not been very good, for men had mistreated and made fun of women as the weaker sex. But after the Neo-Lao party began to administer the region, it became very different. Under the Neo-Lao, things changed psychologically, such as their teaching that women should be as brave as men. For example, although I had gone to school before, my elders advised me not to. They had said that it would not be useful for me as I could not hope to be a high-ranking officer after graduation, that only the children of the elite or rich could expect that. But the Neo-Lao said that women should have the same education as men, and they gave us equal privileges and did not allow anyone to make fun of us. And the old associations were changed into new ones. For example, most of the new teachers and doctors trained were women, and they changed the lives of the very poor, for they shared the land of those who had many rice fields with those who had none. A 17-year-old boy told about the Pathet Lao Revolutionary Army coming to his village. Some people were afraid, mostly those with money. They offered cows to the Pathet Lao soldiers to eat, but the soldiers refused to take them. If they did take them, they paid a suitable price. The truth is that they led the people not to be afraid of anything. Then they organized the election of village and canton chief, and the people were the ones who chose them. Desperation led the CIA to enlist the Hmong tribesmen in military campaigns, which led to the deaths of thousands of Hmong. This was accompanied by secrecy and lying. As was so much of what happened in Laos. In September 1973, a former government official in Laos, Jerome Doolittle, wrote in the New York Times, "The Pentagon's most recent lies about bombing Cambodia bring back a question that often occurred to me when I was press attaché at the American Embassy in Vientiane, Laos. Why did we bother to lie? When I first arrived in Laos, I was instructed to answer all press questions about our massive and merciless bombing campaign in that tiny country with, at the request of the Royal Laotian government, the United States is conducting unarmed reconnaissance flights accompanied by armed escorts who have the right to return fire if fired upon." This was a lie. Every reporter to whom I told it knew it was a lie. Hanoi knew it was a lie. The International Control Commission knew it was a lie. Every interested congressman and newspaper reader knew it was a lie. After all, the lies did serve to keep something from somebody, and the somebody was us. By early 1968, the cruelty of the war began touching the conscience of many Americans. For many others, the problem was that the United States was unable to win the war. While 40,000 American soldiers were dead by this time, 250,000 wounded, with no end in sight. The Vietnam casualties were many times this number. Lyndon Johnson had escalated a brutal war and failed to win it. His popularity was at an all-time low. He could not appear publicly. He could not appear publicly without a demonstration against him and the war. The chant, "LBJ, LBJ, how many kids did you kill today?" was heard in demonstrations throughout the country. In the spring of 1968, Johnson announced he would not run again for president and that negotiations for peace would begin with the Vietnamese in Paris. In the fall of 1968, Richard Nixon, pledging that he would get the United States out of Vietnam, was elected president. He began to withdraw troops. By February 1972, less than 150,000 were left. But the bombing continued. Nixon's policy was Vietnamization. the Saigon government with Vietnamese ground troops using American money and air power would carry on the war. Nixon was not ending the war, he was ending the most unpopular aspect of it, the involvement of American soldiers on the soil of a faraway country. In the spring of 1970, Nixon and Secretary of State Henry Kissinger launched an invasion of Cambodia after a long bombardment that the government never disclosed to the public. The invasion not only led to an outcry of protest in the United States, it was a military failure, and Congress resolved that Nixon could not use American troops in extending the war without congressional approval. The following year, without American troops, the United States supported a South Vietnamese invasion of Laos. This too failed. In 1971, 800,000 tons of bombs were dropped by the United States on Laos, Cambodia, Vietnam. Meantime, the Saigon military regime, headed by President Nguyen Van Thieu, the last of a long succession of Saigon chiefs of state, was keeping thousands of opponents in jail. Some of the first signs of opposition in the United States to the Vietnam War came out of the civil rights movement, perhaps because the experience of black people with the government led them to distrust any claim that it was fighting for freedom. On the very day that Lyndon Johnson was telling the nation in early August 1964 about the Gulf of Tonkin incident, rats. On the very day that Lyndon Johnson was telling the nation in early August 1964 about the Gulf of Tonkin incident and announcing the bombing of North Vietnam, black and white activists were gathering near Philadelphia, Mississippi at a memorial service for the 3 civil rights workers killed there that summer. One of the speakers pointed bitterly to Johnson's use of force in Asia, comparing it with the violence used against blacks in Mississippi. In mid-1965 in Macomb, Mississippi, young blacks who had just learned that a classmate of theirs was killed in Vietnam distributed a leaflet. No Mississippi Negroes should be fighting in Vietnam for the white man's freedom until all the Negro people are free in Mississippi. Negro boys should not honor the draft here in Mississippi. Mothers should encourage their sons not to go. No one has a right to ask us to risk our lives and kill other colored people in Santo Domingo and Vietnam so that the white American can get richer. When Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara visited Mississippi and praised Senator John Stennis, a prominent racist, as a man of very genuine greatness, white and black students marched in protest with placards saying, "In memory of the burned children of Vietnam." The Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee declared in early 1966 that the United States is pursuing an aggressive policy in violation of international law and called for withdrawal from Vietnam. That summer, 6 members of SNCC were arrested for an invasion of an induction center in Atlanta. They were convicted and sentenced to several years in prison. Around the same time, Julian Bond, an SNCC activist who had just been elected to the Georgia House of Representatives, spoke out against the war and the draft, and the House voted that he not be seated because his statements violated the Selective Service Act and tend to bring discredit to the House. The Supreme Court restored Bond to his seat, saying he had the right to free expression under the First Amendment. One of the great sports figures of the nation, Muhammad Ali, the black boxer and heavyweight champion, refused to serve in what he called a white man's war. Boxing authorities took away his title as champion. Martin Luther King Jr. spoke out in 1967 at Riverside Church in New York. "Somehow this madness must cease. We must stop now. I speak as a child of God and brother to the suffering poor of Vietnam. I speak for those whose land is being laid to waste, whose homes are being destroyed, whose culture is being subverted. I speak for the poor of America who are paying the double price of smashed hopes at home and death and corruption in Vietnam. I speak as a citizen of the world, for the world as it stands aghast at the path we have taken. I speak as an American to the leaders of my own nation. The great initiative in this war is ours. The initiative to stop it must be ours. Young men began to refuse to register for the draft, refused to be inducted if called. As early as May 1964, the slogan, "We won't go," was widely publicized. Some who had registered began publicly burning their draft cards to protest the war. One, David O'Brien, burned his draft card in South Boston. He was convicted, and the Supreme Court overruled his argument that this was a protected form of free expression. In October of 1967, there were organized draft card turn-ins all over the country. In San Francisco alone, 300 draft cards were returned to the government. Just before a huge demonstration at the Pentagon that month, a sack of collected draft cards was presented to the Justice Department. In mid-1965, 380 prosecutions were begun against men refusing to be inducted. By mid-1968, 3 years later, that figure was up to 3,305. At the end of '69, there were 33,960 delinquents nationwide. In May 1969, the Oakland Induction Center, where draftees reported from all of Northern California, reported that of 4,400 men ordered to report for induction, 2,400 did not show up. In the first quarter of 1970, the selective service system for the first time could not meet its quota. A Boston University graduate student in history, Philip Supina, wrote on May 1st, 1968 to his draft board in Tucson, Arizona, "I am enclosing the order for me to report for my pre-induction physical exam for the armed forces. I have absolutely no intention to report for that exam or for induction or to any aid in any way the American war effort against the people of Vietnam." He ended his letter by quoting the Spanish philosopher Miguel Unamuno, who during the Spanish Civil War said, "Sometimes to be silent is to lie." Except I'm sure he said it in Spanish. Supina was convicted and sentenced to 4 years in prison. Early in the war, there had been 2 separate incidents barely noticed by most Americans. On November 2nd, 1965, in front of the Pentagon in Washington, as thousands of employees were streaming out of the building in the late afternoon, Norman Morrison, a 32-year-old pacifist, father of 3, stood below the third-floor windows of Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara, doused himself with kerosene, and set himself afire, giving up his life in protest against the war. Also that year in Detroit, an 82-year-old woman named Alice Hertz burned herself to death to make a statement against the horror of Indochina. A remarkable change in sentiment took place. In early 1965, when the bombing of North Vietnam began, 100 people gathered on the Boston Common to voice their indignation. On October 15, 1969, the number of people assembled on the Boston Common to protest the war was 100,000. Perhaps 2 million people across the nation gathered that day in towns and villages that had never seen an anti-war meeting. In the summer of 1965, a few hundred people had gathered in Washington to march in protest against the war. The first in line, historian Stoughton Lynd, SNCC organizer Bob Moses, and longtime pacifist David Dellinger were splattered with red paint by hecklers. But by 1970, the Washington peace rallies were drawing hundreds of thousands of people. In 1971, 20,000 came to Washington to commit civil disobedience, trying to tie up Washington traffic to express their revulsion against the killings still going on in Vietnam. 14,000 of them were arrested, the largest mass arrest in American history. Ooh, there's something to remember. Little trivia. 14,000 arrested, the largest mass arrest in Vietnam history in 1971, Washington. Hundreds of volunteers and the Peace Corps spoke out against the war. In Chile, 92 volunteers defied the Peace Corps director and issued a circular denouncing the war. 800 former members of the Corps issued a statement of protest against what was happening in Vietnam. The poet Robert Lowell, invited to a White House function, refused to come. Arthur Miller, also invited, sent a telegram to the White House. When the guns boom, the arts die. Singer Eartha Kitt, also known as Batgirl, on the old 70s show. Singer Eartha Kitt was invited to a luncheon on the White House lawn and shocked all those present by speaking out in the presence of the president's wife against the war. A teenager called to the White House to accept a prize came and criticized the war. In Hollywood, local artists erected a 60-foot tower of protest on Sunset Boulevard. At the National Book Awards ceremonies in New York, 50 authors and publishers walked out on a speech by Vice President Humphrey in a display of anger at his role in the war. In London, 2 Americans gate-crashed the American ambassador's elegant 4th of July reception and called out a toast. To all the dead and dying in Vietnam. They were carried out by guards. In the Pacific Ocean, 2 young American seamen hijacked an American munitions ship to divert its load of bombs from air bases in Thailand. For 4 days, they took command of the ship and its crew, taking amphetamine pills to stay awake until the ship reached Cambodian waters. The Associated Press reported in late 1972 from York, Pennsylvania, 5 anti-war activists were arrested by the state police today for allegedly sabotaging railroad equipment near a factory that makes bomb casings used in the Vietnam War. Middle-class and professional people, unaccustomed to activism, began to speak up. In May 1970, the New York Times reported from Washington, 1,000 establishment lawyers joined war protest. Corporations began to wonder whether the war was going to hurt their long-range business interests. The Wall Street Journal began criticizing the continuation of the war. As the war became more and more unpopular, people in or close to the government began to break out of the circle of assent. The most dramatic instance was the case of Daniel Ellsberg. Ellsberg was a Harvard-trained economist, a former Marine officer employed by the Rand Corporation, which did special, often secret research for the U.S. government. Ellsberg helped write the Department of Defense history of the war in Vietnam, and then decided to make the top secret document public with the aid of his friend Anthony Russo, a former Rand Corporation man. The two had met in Saigon, where both had been affected in different experiences by direct sight of the war and had become powerfully indignant at what the United States was doing to the people of Vietnam. Ellsberg and Russo spent night after night after hours at a friend's advertising agency duplicating the 7,000-page document. Then Ellsberg gave copies to various congressmen and to the New York Times. In June 1971, the Times began printing selections from what came to be known as the Pentagon Papers. It created a national sensation. The Nixon administration tried to get the Supreme Court to stop further publication, but the court said this was prior restraint of the freedom of the press and thus unconstitutional. Excuse me. The government then indicted Ellsberg and Russo for violating the Espionage Act by releasing classified documents to unauthorized people. They faced long terms in prison if convicted. The judge, however, called off the trial during the jury deliberations because the Watergate events unfolding at the time revealed unfair practices by the prosecution, which is lucky for them, but holding journalists responsible for espionage for publishing information that the government doesn't approve of is very much like what's going on right now, is it not? With Julian Assange and Edward Snowden and Chelsea Manning. Yes, I think it is. Ellsberg, by his bold act, had broken with the usual tactic of dissidents inside the government who bided their time and kept their opinions to themselves, hoping for small changes in policy. A colleague urged him not to leave the government because there he had access, saying, "Don't cut yourself off. Don't cut your throat." Ellsberg replied, "Life exists outside the executive branch." And let's call it quits for now. Thank you for joining me. I hope that you enjoyed the reading. Please do hit the like and subscribe button. Hit that notification bell because YouTube has been known to unsubscribe viewers. And we'll see you next time. Peace.